Well, thanks very much for inviting me to talk. Great, yeah. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to talk to you about the Edinburgh Complex Fluids Partnership, which is the organisation which I am the director of, which is a slightly different model of working with industry. We're based within the University of Edinburgh, but we regularly interact with industry partners. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Edinburgh Complex Fluids Partnership, how we're organised, and then I'm going to go through a couple of case studies of some of the kinds of projects we've done, which hopefully kind of illustrate that type of interaction. So just to sort of give you a brief introduction to sort of my way into industry collaboration. So I did my PhD in 2012. And at the time, I was studying the physics of granulation and shear thickening, and look at the links between the two, which is inherently quite a kind of industrially focused application. So granulation is used a lot in chocolate making, which I'll talk about later on, but also in pharmaceutical and other food applications to form these pellets which dissolve with certain rates. And at the time, I had the opportunity to do a short break from a PhD, which I was seconded to Mars Chocolate to study one of the new processes that they were trying to look at, which was kind of involved granulation and dense suspensions. And at the time was particularly welcome because I just had my first child, and it was nice to have a bit of extra income at that time, particularly on a low PhD stipend. So following my PhD, I then did a 2-year postdoc, again funded by Mars Chocolate, but still within the University of Edinburgh. And then following that, wanted to do another 2-year postdoc, this time working for Corning on a ceramics project. And then eventually in 2020, I moved over to become director of ECFP, where I could have direct a team of researchers, and we interact with a whole bunch of different companies across a whole range of different sectors. So I guess one of the things that I wanted to kind of get across was why work with industry, and not all academics do. So from my personal perspective, I enjoyed the varied projects that come through. So over the kind of last few years, I've worked on a whole range of different things, from chocolate to food extrusion of foods, hand gels during COVID, of course, ink printing, right through to personal care and wastewater treatment. One of the nice things about it is that, in some sense, you have a bit more agency over your funding. You're talking directly to the people that have the money, which is not the case with other grant funding organizations always. I think one of the sort of misconceptions sometimes is that through working with industry, everything's going to be tied up in NDAs and you're not going to be able to publish. And that's certainly not my experience. We've managed to publish a reasonable amount over the last few years. And there's some other benefits as well to do with, meeting interesting scientists from industry, seeing the real world benefits of your work. And as I mentioned before, occasionally getting some additional funding in your pay packet. So ECFP is sort of slightly different to the traditional university model, I think. So I guess, as we've just heard, often science and technology is done within the university, maybe protect some IP. You then start a spin out, and then ideally, if everything goes well, you start to generate revenue and profit. Or another way of getting the work out there might be to then license that IP to a company, and they start to use it in the real world, and you generate money in that way. But 9 out of 10 approximately of startups fail, and this work by CB Insights from 10 years ago or so cited the main reason for startups failing was no market need. So I guess researchers in universities don't always understand what the commercial need is and what's going to work. So ECFP works slightly differently. Obviously this model does work and people use it regularly, but I would say this is a sort of knowledge transfer model where knowledge is kind of one way coming out of the university and going into industry and out into the real world. I would say ECFP is much more a kind of knowledge exchange model where, yes, we have the fundamental knowledge and expertise within academia, but we also recognize there's an awful lot of experience and expertise in industry, and crucially, new questions coming into the university that we can spend time answering. And one of the reasons that organization like ECFP exists, particularly in the UK context, is this idea of research impact and how that's linked to university funding. So impact is basically how the fundamental research within the university makes it out into the real world for benefits, whether that's economic, regulatory, healthcare benefits, environmental benefits, that kind of thing. So ECFP essentially operationalizes this by meeting with companies, finding out what the challenges and opportunities are. We then set up projects which we do within the university, and in an ideal situation, we then also publish fundamental knowledge again, which in an ideal situation becomes a kind of self-perpetuating loop. So we're based within the School of Physics and Astronomy in Edinburgh, and we essentially act as this interface between academics in the group and companies out in the real world. And this is just a small number of the companies we've worked with over the last 10 or so years. But increasingly, we recognize that industry problems don't come packaged as physics problems. So, we're trying to work with colleagues across a range of different schools, including biological sciences, right through to clinical dermatology. And consequently, we were able to access some of the funding across different funding bodies as well. And this kind of gives you an overview of some of the different sectors we've worked with. So it's pretty varied. One of the sort of unique things or unusual things I would say certainly in the UK is the way in which ECFP operates. So what we have is this core team of staff who are employed on long-term contracts by the university to do this kind of work. And what that means is that we're able to access and to do much shorter term projects. So we can work with companies on consultancy projects, which might last, a few days to a few months, right up to the kind of longer term multi-year projects, which, postdocs traditionally do. What this means is that we're able to engage with industry often on their timescales. When they have challenges, they can't wait for you to find the money, which takes 6 months, and then employ someone, which takes another 6 months. Often that their funding for that year will have run out by that point. So through this model, we've been quite successful in working rapidly with industry and to engage with them. So yeah, any one time the kind of team is deployed across a range of different, maybe short-term consultancy or proof of concept projects, and then ideally leading into some longer-term projects. So what do we do? I don't need to tell anyone here what soft matter is, but that is part of what our job is to tell industry what soft matter physics is. Particularly for smaller companies, it's not a household phrase that they've heard of. They might have, understand what chemists or engineers do, but soft matter physicists is slightly more unusual. So basically, we demonstrate to them that, there's all these different systems out there, particle suspensions, emulsions, and they turn up in a whole bunch of different products. And essentially what we try to do is then to sort of link, formulation decisions at the chemistry level through to kind of bulk properties by understanding what's going on at these kind of meso and micro scales in between. So if we take the example of a personal care company, they might be trying to form new products by introducing new chemistries for a range of different reasons, and what they want to do is then have an impact on the consumer perception of the functional benefits. And they might be doing this for a range of different ways. There's lots of regulatory changes coming through European REACH legislation. There's an increased awareness of environmental concerns from consumers, reducing cost, or changing the product efficacy. And either end of the spectrum, you might have sort of different things which characterize the level of formulation. So down at the chemistry end, you're talking about things like molecular weight, chemical species, and up at the consumer end, you've got things like sticky, silky. And the question is, how do you map between the two? In an ideal situation, you have a nice simple map. So you change the chemical composition, you understand how that changes these properties up here. But in reality, it's a horrible mess, and you can't really navigate this in a sensible way. So part of what we try to sort of do in ECFP is to recognize that there is this kind of intermediate stage where the kind of soft matter physics, the physical properties of the system influence the consumer perception, and in turn we can generate physical properties by changing the chemical formulation. So we're kind of breaking the problem down into two sub-mappings, which is perhaps easier to tackle. And that's the kind of model for collaboration that we often use. So, there's a range of different inputs into this. So companies might be trying to replace their petrochemicals with bio-derived chemistries, or get rid of environmentally persistent chemistries like silicones, for instance, and use them in a whole range of different applications. And basically what we do is sit in the middle and help them kind of navigate this in a two-way direction. So, part of that is efficient formulation iteration. Many of the existing products out there have been formulated, 50 years ago, with minor changes over that period. But with the kind of claims by companies like Unilever that they're going to get rid of all their petrochemicals by 2030, there's a huge amount of work to do very rapidly. So kind of doing large scale design of experiments and sort of trial and error tests are not really going to cut it. I don't think, if that timescale is going to be met. And I think the other thing which is appealing to industry is you can specify your chemical formulation, but if you can also do more to specify your product, there are kind of additional patent opportunities out there in terms of protecting the product. Another thing we sort of do with companies is sort of help them recognize that soft matter physics is everywhere. Complex fluids are everywhere, whether that's in foods, personal care, automotive lubricants, things like paints. And also it's a huge business in the UK. So this number is from 2018, but it's a sort of estimate of how many net sales of formulated products are in the UK, and it's a big number. So through studying this kind of soft matter physics, this bit that sits between the chemistry and the sensory properties, the other thing we do effectively is work across sectors, because often these structures that form are not unique to a given sector, and I'll touch on that more when we come to one of the case studies. But often what we find is that by recognizing these problems in a slightly more abstract way, we're able to bring in solutions that may exist in a different sector to a new sector and help them solve challenges in that way. So the first case study I wanted to talk about was some work we did with Mars on the physics of chocolate making, so specifically a process called conching. So basically, well, I'll introduce a little bit of the background physics, and then I'll tell you about conching. So the kind of key physics here is the physics of dense suspension. So if we take a box, we pack particles into it, increasing the solid volume fraction phi. At some point, we can't pack any more into there, and we reach this maximum packing fraction phi m. And we know that as we increase the volume fraction, the viscosity of the suspension will go up. And there's this empirical equation which is used across a whole range of different experimental systems, both nice model-dispersed right through to quite sort of dirty industrial systems. And the relative viscosity of the dense suspension is basically controlled by two parameters. It's controlled by the solid volume fraction, which is kind of your formulation decision, and by phi m, which is kind of set by the geometry of the system. And this, it fits the data really well across a whole range of different systems. So we can see that the volume fraction, the viscosity increases as the volume fraction goes up and diverges at phi m. So one of the things I was studying my PhD was thinking about what happens when you go beyond phi m. So we've got this nice increase in viscosity here, and here we can see that we've got flowing suspensions, which is the kind of behavior that we have down here. And then when we go over phi m, the system can no longer flow. It kind of exceeds its the kind of volume which contains it, and the system granulates, creating lots of new surface area. So yeah, I'm just kind of studying this transition, and at the same time, there's lots of work going on into what was driving some of the behavior seen in shear thickening systems. And one of the key points that came out of that was that the interparticle friction controls where the system will where the maximum volume fraction is. So for this system, we've got a high frictional state, and we've got this jamming volume fraction. And experimentally, we can access a different frictional state, and we can see that phi m has moved up, and the transition between a flowing state and a jam state has changed. So in chocolate making, there's this process called conching, where you start off with this kind of unappealing, granular, dry mess, and through mechanical mixing and addition of a small amount of an additive at the end, you can kind of transition through to this kind of nice fluid chocolate, which we would recognize as molten chocolate in our mouth. And we can see that if we flip this around, there's certain similarities between here. We kind of moving from a dry granular state over here through to a flowing state, and you can see that the system traverses a similar thing. But crucially, here I'm explicitly changing the volume fraction. I'm changing the ratio of the solid to liquid. Here, the volume fraction is essentially the same. Nothing's being added until this very last state, and yet the process is changing. So if we go back to the Krieger-Doherty equation and look at what that's telling us, in the kind of model system here, we're changing phi with a constant phi m and getting different behavior. Whereas in the other system, in the chocolate system, we have constant phi, and so we can kind of infer from this that we're doing something to phi m. And in fact, that's what we found, and we published in our paper in 2019. So if we take this system and conch it at different volume fractions, which are the red circles here, and then dilute it to get a whole family of viscosities for these systems, we can see that the divergence moves around. So the higher the volume fraction that we conch at, the higher we can shift the maximum jamming volume fraction. I mean, if we kind of compare this behavior to some nice work that was done by Lewis and Nielsen in the late 60s, where they took monodispersed spheres and then systematically sintered them together into larger and larger aggregates, we can kind of see a similar behavior where the larger the aggregate, the lower the jamming volume fraction. So the kind of inference here is that we're doing the opposite. We're starting off with something which is quite aggregated. We're breaking that up into something which is less aggregated through application of mechanical through application of mechanical shear. So the kind of key takeaway here is that conching increases phi m by breaking up aggregates. The other part to this is this final step, the addition of the lecithin, which is a phospholipid, which kind of quite dramatically changes the visual appearance and the rheology of the system. And the kind of conventional understanding, which is sort of pervaded for the last 50 or so years, is that it promotes wetting on the sucrose surfaces and then acts as a steric stabilizer to keep sucrose particles apart. But in the context of this understanding around friction being an important thing, what we found was that the high shear viscosity decreases as we increase the lecithin content. So what that kind of means is for a constant volume fraction, which is what we're at here, simply changing the lecithin content, we're then moving from a highly frictional state down to a lower frictional state, and thus seeing this decrease in high shear viscosity. And the kind of cartoon picture of that is that we have a system which is constrained to roll past each other initially, and then we have the lecithin, we're allowing the system to slide past each other. So I think this is quite a good example of where we're able to sort of traverse this range of length scales from understanding of the molecular scale, the lecithin, right through to the kind of sensory properties that a consumer might have when they have this molten chocolate in their mouth. And we've done this by kind of understanding the dense suspension rheology of the intermediate length scales and how that affects the kind of the bulk rheology. And we're trying to go a little bit further. So we've been doing some work with STFC Hartree, colleagues with Patrick, trying to simulate cocoa butter with phospholipid between two sucrose surfaces. And the idea is that eventually we'll be able to extract a friction coefficient from this, hopefully plug that into some discrete element model simulations done by my colleague Chris Ness in Edinburgh, and then hopefully recover the kind of experimental result that we've measured. So the impact of this was that we delivered this fundamental insight into conching, and why this is important for a company like Mars is that conching requires a huge amount of energy So this is a kind of typical power versus time profile for the conching process. And they are, conching tons and tons of this per hour. What we were eventually able to deliver them was a kind of target of 25-fold reduction in energy use, simply based on the understanding of the amount of force to pull apart some of these aggregate particles. I'm not saying they've necessarily got there yet, but it sort of, at least it allows them to sort of understand where they could end up. The other thing, which in terms of the role of the emulsifiers, is that things like lecithin have an E number. In the future, if a company wanted to kind of move to what they call clean labels, so getting rid of some of these E numbers, understanding what the molecule is actually doing kind of gives you a rational way of then going to find a replacement. And some of this work, some of this underpinning dense suspension physics, also ended up in some of the work we did with other companies as well. Just finally on the chocolate, I mentioned this cross-sector fertilization, so taking this understanding and taking it to different sectors. So here we see there's sort of different stages of chocolate going from this granular to liquid suspension. And here we can see very similar stages for production of concrete. And the similarity goes further. If we look at the power versus time curve, we see this non-monotonic peaked behavior for mixing chocolate. And we see something similar for the mixing of concrete. Here, the variable on the x-axis is time, and here they're actually adding water, but some of the same underpinning physics ties these two together. So really what we'd like to do, and we're in the process of doing, is then engaging with concrete companies. Concrete companies add these super plasticizers to concrete, or high water reducing agents, to improve the packing of the solid particles, reduce the amount of water they need. But all of these are kind of petrochemically derived chemicals, and they're trying to move away from certain chemistries. So I think the understanding that we've gained from chocolate potentially leads to new insights into how you might replace some of those. How am I doing for time? Yeah, good. Okay, so the second case study I wanted to talk about was some of the work we've done more recently with Corning, work that we published earlier this year, and it's on designing complex fluids for impact protection. So Corning are a very interesting company. They've got a huge amount of innovation in their history. So one of the things we've previously worked on them with is the cell core catalyst substrates. So these are, I think, found in something like 1/3 of UK cars. So these are the kind of catalytic honeycomb structures which platinum and palladium catalysts are put onto to convert waste combustion gases into less environmentally harmful things. But this project was kind of working with their glass division. One of the things they invented recently, or relatively recently, was the Corning Gorilla Glass, which is probably on most of the screens in this room. One of the things that I sort of found particularly interesting was when I visited their diesel particulate factory in 2019. It's just the sheer scale of this. So scale bar on here. For me, I found it particularly fascinating that work that we could be doing in our labs in Edinburgh could somehow end up in a site as large as this. So this kind of starting hypothesis or question for this project was, an understanding that certain fluids get kind of harder during impact. So something like a discontinuous shear thickening fluid, which is, someone running on cornstarch and water here. And there's technology out there that has taken this kind of understanding and put it into Kevlar matrices and created body armor. So the question was, could you take a shear thickening fluid and put it into something like a screen to make the screen resist impact better? So my colleague James, who was leading on this project, basically developed some of the underpinning theory for this. But the essential model is that if you've got a glass substrate with some kind of fluid sandwich between, and then your kind of screen layer underneath, the kind of key question is, can you protect this top layer of glass? The principal failure mechanism is if the bending moment exceeds the maximum for the glass, and it will break. So the kind of idea is, can we minimize the bending moment for these types of impact? So it's quite a complicated problem. So the bending of the glass, the resultant kind of flow field, and the fluid properties are all kind of coupled together in a series of equations. James was able to kind of simplify the problem somewhat by focusing on impacts which are small relative to the larger screen. So we can essentially simplify the problem into a kind of flat squeeze flow problem, which makes kind of the series of coupled equations significantly easier to deal with. So basically, you end up with a set of simultaneous equations which you can solve together to come up with a solution. So these graphs here are purely for Newtonian fluids. So we can kind of see that for a highly viscous fluid, there is a certain amount of deformation as a function of time, but then all of the energy is dissipated and there's no further deformation. For very low viscosity fluids, the deformation isn't stopped, and basically the top of the screen crashes into the bottom and breaks. And if you plot the force as a function of time as well, we can see that for the very highly viscous fluids, the force dies away, whereas for the very inviscid fluids, there's a spike as the top screen hits the lower screen. And then from that, we can then calculate the bending moment, and the kind of peak bending moment here, which is plotted in these small dots, that is then plotted on this graph. So then we can come up with an optimal fluid based on the maximum moment as a function of this parameter C, which scales with the square root of the viscosity. So we can kind of come up with an optimal fluid viscosity for this system. We then validated this using a kind of pseudo 2D experimental setup. So you can just about make it out. But we have an impactor pushing down on a plate of glass with a fluid beneath. And then we have a photoelastic PDMS block beneath that. And if I get the video to play again, you can see that as the stress is transferred down to the PDMS block and it's deformed, it lights up in the cross polarizer. So we can kind of visualize the extent of the stress transferred to the lower block. So we can do this for a whole range of different velocities, spanning 2 orders of magnitude. And through this kind of numerical analysis, we're able to collapse all of these different curves onto a kind of singular behavior, which kind of gives a normalized force per unit length as a function of the indentation height. And so we've got the colored data here for all of the different velocities, and the fit to the model is this dashed line here. So this is all for Newtonian fluids, and it seems to work pretty well. Then the question was, well, what about non-Newtonian fluids, specifically shear thickening fluids, was the original question. So for this, in the kind of numerical analysis, we used a power law approach. Experimentally, we had a shear thinning fluid made of small, so it was a dense suspension of particles, both for the shear thinning fluid and the shear thickening fluid, you can see in blue here. So we took a very similar approach. We're able to now, rather than optimize for fluid viscosity, we're able to optimize for N, the power. And you can see here, again, there's a kind of minimum in N around 0.4, which tells us that, in fact, surprisingly, a shear thinning fluid is optimal for minimizing these peak bending moments. And the kind of physical rationale for that is that, at large gaps, the fluid is harder to push out. There's lower shear rates, higher viscosity, and there's a higher force at that point. And as the gap thins down, there's a higher shear rates, but the fluid thins to smaller viscosities, and thus F is lowered. So the kind of force as a function of time during the impact is smoothed and reduces the peak in bending moment. So the kind of surprising outcome for this and the kind of interest for Corning was that, contrary to our initial hypothesis or their initial hypothesis, in fact, shear thinning fluids appear to be better than other types of fluids for impact protection. Corning have gone on to file several patents protecting this invention. We published the work earlier this year, and we continue to work with Corning to try and understand how they're using these patents in real products. The final case study I wanted to touch on is by no way complete. We're just starting out on this process. This is something called formulation metamorphosis, which is something of interest to pharmaceutical world and regulators. And the rationale for this is some literature data on Zavirax, which is a kind of antiviral cream that you put on cold sores. And there was a study done that came out. Well, there's quite a lot of work, but there was a paper that came out in 2022 showing that for exactly the same formulation, whether it was dispensed from a tube or whether it was dispensed from a pump, gave different bioavailability. So the amount of active inside the body as the treatment was used over a 48-hour period, which is both surprising and also worries the hell out of the regulators. They don't like this at all, and neither do the company that make it, surprisingly. So there was a small amount of work done into what's driving this. Clearly the dispensing method is different. This Zavirax comes out of a pump, comes out of a smaller orifice, so that the supposition is that there's a kind of higher stress field on it or something like that. And this group, this paper by Jung et al., they did some confocal Raman and were able to identify that there was sort of small droplets of one of the components, dimethicone, separating out from the rest. That's about as far as they got. That, in terms of how it changes the bioavailability and what causes this phase separation is unknown. So we have an ongoing PhD project sort of studying this formulation metamorphosis process more generally. The kind of underpinning chassis they used in this, the kind of gelled emulsion is not uncommon. It's used across a whole range of different topical and pharmaceutical products. So it's likely that the kind of problems encountered here are somewhat generic. And really the question are what are the stresses, the strain rates, the length scales driving this change in microstructure, which then changes the bioavailability. And very finally, just something completely different, engagement with SMEs. A lot of the work I've talked about is engaging with big companies where, you're talking to scientists who've come out of universities. You can speak in a common language, but SMEs are different, particularly those which maybe haven't come out of a lab. So in Scotland, we've got a lot of food and drink SMEs. I've plotted the number of food and drink SMEs across the whole geography of Scotland, overlaid on a map, which kind of tells you how long it takes to drive to some of these from Edinburgh. So it's clear that a lot of these companies can't really engage with the University of Edinburgh in a kind of meaningful way without taking lots of time out of their week to come and visit us, which is perhaps not feasible for these smaller companies. It's particularly challenging in the food and drink industry. Often these come out of kitchens, not labs. So if you say, well, we're soft matter physicists, and they say, well, so what? We're going to make our fudge or whatever it is. So really what we wanted to think about was how do we engage with some of these companies, and how do we drive science into this sector. So earlier this year, we commissioned an ECFP mobile lab in a van, which hopefully in the next couple of months, if I can finalize all of the health and safety and the insurance paperwork, we can get this out on the road, going out to companies, engaging with them on their sites of business, and we're going to employ someone to run this thing, to engage. We've got a bit of kit, we've got a rheometer, we've got a universal testing machine, and some kind of basic microscopy, so we can kind of hopefully sell what ECFP does, what soft matter physics is all about, and sort of drive some engagement in that sector. And that is me.
Okay, thank you very much. Question. So one issue is always the regulatory bodies who tell you what you can and can't put in things. Have you ever worked with any of those regulatory bodies to try and, because these regulations are often set up 50 odd years ago, and things have moved on since then.
Yeah, so that final project I mentioned, the formulation metamorphosis, we are engaging with the US FDA on that. This area is something that they funded some work into themselves. So the paper by Young et al. Came out of a body of work that they funded, but it's by no means answered yet, and it's something that they are concerned about, both in in terms of some of the testing they do to assess bioavailability, which is often done by taking a piece of human skin on something they call a Franz diffusion cell. You kind of smear some of the formulation on there, and then you look at the traversal through that as a function of time. But there's some questions. If you don't control the way in which you shear that down to be at least in some way reminiscent of how a human consumer would use that, then